Hello everybody and welcome back for another video. This week I want to talk about exposure. More specifically, why I shoot in manual exposure mode. And there will be a little bit of an on-location demonstration partway through the video. But before then, I do want to start with a little bit of an assumption. And I'm making the assumption that you all understand the exposure triangle. Now, if you don't, or you want to just brush up on it a little bit, I've done a video all about that, and there's a link in the description below. So what I suggest you do is pause this video, jump down to the description, find that video, go and watch that, and then when you're done, come back and restart, and we'll carry on. Right, let's crack on then, shall we? And we're going to start by talking about exposure modes. Now, most cameras will have 4 main exposure modes. 3 are semi-automatic, and then we have 1 full manual mode. Now, those semi-automatic modes include program shift, which is where the camera decides which aperture and shutter speed to use in order to correctly expose the image. We have shutter priority, sometimes called time value, and that's where the photographer decides what shutter speed to use and the camera decides which aperture to set in order to expose the image properly. And then finally, the final semi-automatic mode we have is aperture priority, or sometimes known as aperture value. And that's where the photographer sets the aperture and then the camera decides which shutter speed to use in order to correctly expose the image. Now, these semi-automatic modes depend on the camera's metering system. The camera uses its metering system to determine what the correct exposure should be. Now, the metering systems in most modern cameras is very, very sophisticated, but it is easily fooled. So, for example, if you're shooting in the snow, the camera actually gets fooled into thinking that conditions are brighter than they really are. And so it tends to underexpose the image. Similarly, if you're shooting at night, the camera has a tendency to overexpose the image. Now, in manual mode, the photographer is responsible for setting both the shutter speed and the aperture, and that means that the exposure is fully within their control. Now, that might sound a little bit more complicated, but with the introduction of live view, using manual mode has become relatively simple. So I've come to Grasmere for this shot. I'm set up facing Silver Howe, and I have some stones in the foreground, and they're acting as some foreground interest. The camera set up relatively low in order to cut the distance between my foreground and my background, and I've already dialed in most of my settings. I'm shooting at f11 because that gives me the best compromise between depth of field with an acceptable level of diffraction, and obviously I'm shooting at ISO 100 because I want to have the minimum amount of digital noise in the image. So in order to get my exposure correct, the only thing that I now need to do is to dial in my shutter speed. Now, my Canon 6D has a couple of features that are going to help me get my shutter speed spot on. The first of those is the live view histogram. Now, live view was a revelation for me when I first got a camera with live view. It completely changed the way I did my photography. I use it for everything. I use it for composition, I use it for focusing, and I also use it for exposure. And what the histogram does is it allows me to see where my tones are. Have I got lots of bright tones? I have lots of dark tones. Most importantly, am I clipping my highlights? Am I recording any data as pure white, so that there's absolutely no detail there at all? And that's something that I'm going to try and avoid. The second feature that the Canon 6D has is exposure simulation. And what that means is that the brightness of the LCD attempts to replicate what the shot's going to look like. So as I change my shutter speed, the image on the back of my camera gets brighter or darker depending on which way I'm going. And that allows me to understand exactly what the shot's going to look like when I take it. So as I say, all that's left for me to do is to set my shutter speed, and I'm going to use the live view histogram in order to do that. Now, what I'm looking to do is to get a nice even distribution of tones throughout the histogram. I don't want them too far to the right, to the highlights. I don't want them too far to the left, to the shadows. I want them sort of nicely evenly distributed, and I want to pay specific attention to making sure I don't clip any of the highlights. Now this is coming up with a shutter speed of about half a second, and that's absolutely perfect for this shot. That half a second should just be enough to blur this water and give a quite nice kind of ethereal effect without making it completely milky, so it maintains a little bit of texture. Now once again, I've made the assumption that you all understand how to read a histogram. If you don't know how to do that, I've created another video for you. So you might want to go and check that out when you finish with this one. Once again, the link is in the description below. Now for me, the most important thing when it comes to setting the exposure is making sure I don't clip the highlights. This is where you have parts of the image that are so bright that the camera sensor records them as completely white. That means that there's absolutely no information there at all. And so when I get the photo into Lightroom later and I try to recover that, I can't. There's just no detail. And so that's what I try to do all the time, is make sure I at least protect those highlights and I have some detail in the brightest part of the image. Now, when I'm setting my shutter speed, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get a nice even distribution of the tones throughout the histogram. I don't want too many tones towards the right-hand side, towards the highlights. I don't want too much towards the left-hand side, towards the shadows. I'm trying to get a nice even balance, and I do that because that gives me the best tones when it comes to post-processing later on. But there is another school of thought that's referred to as expose to the right. And this is where you try and expose your image as brightly as you possibly can without clipping. So you get as close to the right hand side as you possibly can without blowing out your highlights. Now the theory is this, that by doing that you capture as much information about the scene as possible. And you can try this for yourself. Go out there and go and take an exposure where you've done just that. You set the exposure as far to the right hand side as you possibly can without clipping the highlights, without blowing out those highlights. And then take a second exposure where you've reduced the shutter speed by 2 stops. And then compare those two images, look at the file sizes, and I bet you anything you like that that first image will be larger than the second one, and that's because it contains more information. Now there are other reasons why you want to shoot in manual exposure mode. The first one is when you want to shoot multiple exposures that you're going to stitch together. For example, when you're shooting a panorama. And you want all of those exposures to be exactly the same. So when you come to stitch them together, the software that does that doesn't have any problems at all. The problem if you shoot in something, let's say like aperture priority, is as you're taking your shots, the camera may adjust the exposure as you're going through. And at worst, what will happen is that means that you'll struggle to stitch the images together. And best, you'll end up with a situation where you kind of get this banding, where the exposure has been changed between shots. So if you're going to do panoramas, you need to be able to shoot in manual mode. The second time that being able to shoot in manual mode comes in handy is when you're doing long exposures. Now typically in most cameras, if you want to do an exposure over 30 seconds, then you need to shoot in what's called bulb mode. Now in bulb mode, the photographer is responsible for opening the shutter and then for closing it again. And so they have to time the exposure themselves. Now, if you're in a position where you're used to deciding what the shutter speed should be for an exposure, then shooting in bulb mode becomes second nature. Now, if we're going to talk about exposure, we have to talk about dynamic range. Now, the dynamic range of a scene is the difference between the very darkest area and the very brightest, and it's measured in stops. And cameras also have a dynamic range. My Canon 6D has a dynamic range of somewhere in the region of about 12 stops. Now the Nikon D850, that has a dynamic range of somewhere in the region of 15 stops. And so that can capture a much wider range of tones than my Canon. Now, if the dynamic range of a scene is within that of your camera, you don't have any problems at all, really. But if the dynamic range of a scene exceeds that of your camera, and that's more likely to happen with my Canon than it is with that Nikon D850, then you're going to start getting into problems. And you're either going to clip your highlights, clip your shadows, or both. Now there are a couple of ways of dealing with scenes with high dynamic range. The first, of course, is HDR blending, and that involves taking multiple shots at different exposures. So typically you'll take a normal exposure, you'll take one darker exposure where you're capturing the detail in the highlights, and then you'll take a brighter exposure where you're capturing the detail in the shadows. Now when you get home, you take those exposures and you blend them together using computer software, and what that does is that creates a single image from those three exposures. And generally what it does is it takes the brighter areas from the darker exposure and the darker areas from the brighter exposure, and what that ends up doing is creating a final image that has a better tonal range so that you get much more detail in those problematic dark and light areas. Unfortunately, HDR isn't without its problems. The first of those issues comes if you have any movement in the scene at all, and that causes issues when you're trying to blend those images together. And what happens is the images don't line up, and so you get this weird kind of ghosting effect. The second problem, and the one that impacts me the most, is that sometimes the tonality of the image isn't natural. Your shadows are just too bright, your highlights are just too dark, and it looks unnatural. And that's why for me, I very rarely use HDR, and actually there is only one image in my portfolio that is an HDR blend. Now today there is an alternative to HDR. It's known as luminosity masking, and it's a technique that you do in Photoshop. Now personally, I have never tried luminosity masking. It's one of those things I haven't got round to doing. I think I'm often put off by the hyper-real images that you get that are examples of luminosity masking. And although they can look very dramatic and fantastic, they're almost as unreal as some of the HDR examples. And so I think that's put me off a little bit, and that's why I've never tried it. But I will reserve judgment on that until I've actually found the time to give it a go myself. At present, my preferred approach to dealing with scenes with a high dynamic range is to use ND graduated filters to cover the sky, to darken the sky. Typically, that's going to be the brightest part of most scenes. But if the dynamic range of a scene becomes too great for me to use grads, then I simply avoid shooting them. Typically, I'll only shoot in the direction of the sun until it gets to the point where it peaks above the hills. And then I turn my camera away and I look for compositions that are going to benefit from side light. So that's just about it for this video. If you've never tried shooting in manual mode before, next time you're out, give it a go. If you use the live view histogram to help you set the shutter speed, it's actually quite simple. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's been useful. If it has been, give it a thumbs up, and hopefully you'll join me next time. I think we're going to be talking about black and white landscape photography, so make sure you join me for that.